Hello, my name is Jeffrey Nicholas. I'm an associate professor of philosophy at Providence College. This is the lecture series on Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, and this is the third lecture, Virtue. I invite you to watch the two previous lectures, one on who Aristotle is, and the second one on the concept of eudaimonia, which we generally translate as happiness, but is better translated as self-fulfillment. In this lecture, I will be talking about Aristotle's virtue theory, and particularly his definition of virtue. And then you can watch the remaining six episodes, which discuss voluntary action, incontinence, friendship, contemplation, the intellectual virtues, and then assessing Aristotle. So to begin, I just want to think about the definition of virtue for Aristotle, as he puts it in the Nicomachean Ethics. So he says, virtue is a characteristic marked by choice, residing in a mean relative to us, a characteristic defined by reason, as the prudent person would define it. Sorry for the typo there. So we're looking at characteristics. What are these characteristics? And so virtues are going to be these characteristics. So when we think about a characteristic, what are we talking about? Well, we're not talking about a feeling or a capacity. And Aristotle addresses this, right? We are neither praised nor blamed for having particular feelings, nor are we praised or blamed for having particular capacities. Hitler, to go back to an old stag here, had a capacity for good. He just didn't exercise that capacity. And we all have various feelings about different things. And sometimes our feelings are not in our control. And so we're neither praised or blamed for having these feelings, whether we're sad or happy or whatever it might be. So if a characteristic is not a feeling or a capacity, then what is it that we're talking about? And Aristotle says that this characteristic that we're going to define as virtue is a disposition to act in a certain way. That is, we are disposed, or we are tending to act in this or that way on a regular occasion, right? So it's not that one day I'm brave and the next day I'm not. It's more that over a consistent lifetime, I tend to be brave in most or even all of my actions. And in being brave, I develop a disposition to act brave the next time around. So here we're talking about having different ways of acting, and when we have these options, disposed to act this way rather than that way. Well, how do we know which way is the right way? Aristotle says that virtue is a mean between two extremes. So virtue, or this disposition, consists in a mean between an excess and a deficiency. Aristotle famously says that one can err or make mistakes in many ways, but only one way is correct. Now, we might quibble a little bit with that, but the idea here is that in most situations, if not in all situations, there's one way that we can find that goes between an excess or a deficiency to find the right way to act here. So in a situation where bravery is called for, we think of bravery as a mean between a rashness, which would be too much courage, and fear or being yellow-bellied, which is a deficiency of courage. We might say the same thing about any of the virtues. So patience, waiting too long to achieve what we want, that would be an excess. And then being hyper and just demanding things here and now, that would be a deficiency of patience. So the disposition that we're looking for is a disposition to always aim for the middle ground between excess and deficiency in different ways. Now this middle ground, is going to be relative to us. Now I want to be careful here. Aristotle is not saying that virtue is relativism, nor is he saying that ethics is relativism. So if you have some questions about this, I invite you to watch another lecture in my YouTube series on relativism. And relativism, in short, is the idea that there are no universal truths and no universal virtues. So what Aristotle is saying is that there is a universal virtue: bravery, patience. And these are universal virtues, but they're going to be relative to us. So to give you an example, I have not been trained in military combat. I only shot a gun once or twice. So bravery for me is going to be different from someone who has had military training, who perhaps is a Navy SEAL, right? And so if we were both in a crowded auditorium and a gunman comes in and starts shooting, then my reaction, my bravery, is going to be different than the bravery of the Navy SEAL. I might duck behind a chair, and that might be the brave thing for me to do. For example, if I'm covering someone else, if I'm covering my child so that the child does not get shot, then that would be an act of bravery for me. But the Navy SEAL might be able to do more defensive things and find a way to undermine the attacker. So the virtue, the mean, is relative to our own characteristics and our own training. And so that includes our own nature. The example I like to give here is someone who has a sweet tooth versus someone who doesn't like sweets at all. So the virtue of temperance is going to be different for these two people. Someone who doesn't like sweets isn't going to really be tempted to eat a whole chocolate cake, and so it's not really a virtue for him or her to avoid the chocolate cake. Whereas someone who is tempted by sweets, as myself would be, then the virtue is, for me, temperance would require having a small piece of cake rather than eating the whole cake. So the virtues are going to be relative to our own nature. So a runner, for instance, is going to have a different kind of training and a different kind of nature than someone who's an academic. And so the academic might be challenged to exercise an hour a day, whereas the runner just loves to run all the time. And so the virtue of getting the right exercise will be a mean between an excess and a deficiency defined by the nature and training of the runner or the nature and training of the academic. Now, this mean is defined by reason. So again, we're not talking about emotions or feelings here. We're talking about how we think about things, what our reason leads us to in order to achieve eudaimonia, or self-fulfillment. Okay, so reason is, to go back to the previous lecture, reason is one of the peculiar functions of Homo sapiens sapiens, a peculiar function of the rational animal that we at least are one example of. And so we use our reason to figure out, well, what is the mean between an excess of fear or an excess of courage, right? And Aristotle says this interesting thing, that this reference to reason is how the intelligent person defines it. This brings in the concept of the phronimos. By phronimos, he just means someone who is an exemplar of good living, someone that we consider to be a virtuous person. Obviously, Jesus Christ would be an example, Gandhi, Martin Luther King Jr. We can think of many examples, and if I ask you who your hero is, you might say one of your parents or an uncle or someone else. And so what Aristotle is trying to get at is that we have in our culture various people that we think live the best kind of life and to achieve that happiness. Now, for Aristotle, that culture was much more uniform than our own culture. And so he's looking for a model that everyone would look at and say, oh, this is a great person. For many of us, we live in a pluralistic culture where there might not be just that one person that we can look up to, and everyone would agree that this person is the phronimos, or the ideal kind of person. And that becomes a challenge for us, but it doesn't mean that we can't think through what virtue requires of us. And here, Aristotle's just saying, if we have questions about virtue, there are people that we can look to who live a eudaimonic life, who live a life of virtue, that we can say, yes, I want to be like that person. So when we come down then to what virtue is, it's this this action, a disposition to act in a particular way between an excess and a deficiency in various areas of our life, which we determine by our reason. What is the right thing to do here? And it's not that we stop and think every time, oh, I've got to figure out what the right thing to do is here. Rather, what we do is we develop habits or dispositions to act in this way, because sometimes we don't have the time or the energy to think what's the right thing to do here. And so virtue is very important. So this leads us to a question that I'd like you to just pause a moment and think about. Who is your hero or heroes? What kind of actions do they engage in? What qualities do they have? Would you define these qualities as a middle ground between an excess and deficiency? I just watched the movie The Founder, which is about Ray Kroc, who took the original idea of the McDonald's brothers and expanded it into this great international chain. And there are various characteristics that he has that perhaps we might say, oh, those are interesting qualities. Maybe I would like to be like that, or they might be qualities that we don't want to be like. I was talking about this to another one of my students, and he said it's sort of like the Wolf of Wall Street. And I know many people admire the Wolf of Wall Street, and we think about being that rich guy. But is that what we consider someone who is reasonable, who does achieve a flourishing life? And again, when I talk about eudaimonia, I'm talking about flourishing, about self-actualization, and not just about money and happiness and those sorts of things, which we might typically associate with what we think of as the ideal person in our own day. There are also some things that do not admit or do not have a middle ground. So Aristotle says spite. You can't be spiteful in the right way at the right time with the right person. Shamelessness is not something that you can do in the right way in the right time. Adultery is not something that you commit with the right person in the right time in the right situation. Theft and murder. These are all already extremes, right? If we end up murdering someone, then we've already gone to an extreme that we need to back away from. Okay, and so then we can look at a list of virtues and define them, these virtues here, according to what emotion or domain they cover. So courage covers fear, temperance the desire for pleasure, generosity giving away money, and then the excess and defect of them, right? So I've already talked about fear. Let's look at generosity. This involves giving away money. Of course, there's an extravagance where we give away so much money that we don't have enough for ourselves. And then there's stinginess like Scrooge where we don't give enough away. For Aristotle, pride is a virtue. Many Christians would find that a wrong kind of thing to say is a virtue. And that might be something that we can talk about at some point. Some other virtues include truthfulness, wittiness, friendliness, modesty, righteous indignation. I think our culture has trouble dealing with righteous indignation. We think that anger is always wrong. But in fact, we can have anger that is about other people's fortunes, where maybe one extreme would be envy and the other extreme would be spite, but where it might just be, hey, this isn't right, there has to be something done to achieve this. So these are the kinds of virtues that we might talk about, and just an analysis of them in terms of their domain that they cover, and then the kinds of extremes they have. Thank you.